Out-of-bounds movement in Metroid Prime is a common point of confusion for new runners. However, it's not as difficult as you might be thinking. This video is going to be broken down into a few sections to cover the general concepts of out-of-bounds. Timestamps will be available in the description. You might be moving outside of the intended area, but you can still move a control Samus the same way as you would inbounds. L jumps, R jumps, it's all the same. It's not Samus that moves differently, but the way that she interacts with the environment. The details of these interactions will be covered shortly. As a brief summary, moving while out of bounds requires a certain level of intuitive knowledge on where you are and where you will be. Now, let's make some sense of that. Intuition can be defined as having an understanding of something without having to actively think about it. This is an important skill to have when running Prime because building speed involves turning sideways. This implies that you can't see where you're going. Instead, you have to feel where you're going. Additionally, being out of bounds can sometimes lead to situations where you don't have a visual reference at all. Don't worry, if you feel like you don't have a strong intuition yet, it will come with time. As mentioned previously, there are a few things to take into consideration when out of bounds. These will be covered in no particular order, but are all important things to know. Each individual room in Prime is surrounded by a bounding box based on the collision of the room. Common or otherwise accepted terminology includes room, which is the massive collision you're inside while you're playing the game as intended, world or Aether Box, which describes the area between the room's collision and the bounding box of the room, Aether, which describes the area outside of the bounding box of the room, and finally Prioritized Aether Box, or PAB, which is a more accurate way of saying room that you are currently transitioned to. Your PAB is the room that appears when you open the map or otherwise observed in the mini-map in the upper right hand corner of the screen. Being in the Aether causes you to start floating. Floating, in this case, is a slow and constant upwards movement. As long as you remain in the Aether, you will always float. You will also notice that, despite no collision around, you're still able to stand and walk around on the X and Y axes. Think about it as if you are touching a floor and a ceiling at the same time. However, if you were to be morphed, this changes things. Being in Morph Ball allows you to fall while in the Aether. This is important because the top of the Aether Box, or the Skywalk, is impossible to exit without using Morph. Note that this is the general rule, but exceptions do exist. An interesting property of being in the Aether is that you are in Jump State 0 or grounded. This means that you are able to jump, but don't gain any height if you remain in the Aether. The solution? Leaving the Aether as you jump. This brings us to an important tech known as Aether Jumping. To perform an Aether Jump, you move out of the Aether and press B within 3 frames of doing so. The most widely used technique for this is to flick the control stick and tap B. Don't forget, once you successfully Aether Jump, you will need to move back into the Aether at the apex of your jump or else you will fall. A common technique used to give yourself leeway for Aether Jumps is to use a corner. You enter limited influence and are unable to maneuver to re-enter the Aether after missing an Aether Jump, so you can use a corner to catch your fall and lessen the impact of a mistake. As a new runner, or a runner new to out of bounds, you're sure to find yourself at the bottom of Aether Box, or Aether Floor, of a large room with seemingly no way to recover. Something you will notice is that you will repeatedly bounce up and down. This is the floating mechanic at work. What's happening is that you are floating out of the Aether and falling back into it over and over. Thankfully, since the Aether gives us Jump State 0, we can jump from the Aether Floor. There's a catch to this though. We can only jump while in Jump State 3, or Coyote Time. Coyote Time can be defined as the period of time between walking off a ledge and the game updating you to a falling state. We only have a 2-frame window to jump from the Aether Floor as opposed to 3 from the sides. Now that you're more familiar with the properties of Aether, let's move on to the interactions with room collision. Collision is two-sided, in terms of not being able to pass through it. However, the side of the wall that is facing out of bounds is sticky. This means that jumping into the back side of a wall will halt your momentum. If this is on a horizontal surface, then you will continually bounce in place as the game tries to find a standable spot for you to land on. If this is a slope surface, you will bounce down the slope. Now that you've been introduced to out-of-bounds concepts, let's go over how to navigate. The term standable spot is used to describe any spot you can stand with jump state 0 while out of bounds. Standable spots can be pieces of collision that stick out from the wall, doors, or most commonly the vertices of two pieces of collision. This is one of the most important things to remember for navigating out of bounds. We can navigate most individual rooms with this knowledge alone, but let's look into how Prime handles loading and unloading rooms. There are three main ways to load a room. 1. Hitting the load trigger. This will subsequently unload other rooms in most cases. 2. Manual loading. This involves shooting a door and walking near it. Manual loading by itself does not unload other rooms, so there is a risk of crashing the game if you're not careful. Crashes can occur if too many things are loaded at once, or more technically, the object limit is reached. There is generally only a risk of crashing if you are manually loading rooms because, as mentioned before, hitting load triggers unloads other rooms before loading its respective room. The third method of loading is auto-loading. This means that when you enter a certain room, all of the connecting rooms are loaded as well. Some examples of this are Gathering Hall, Ruined Fountain, and Transport to Magmoor Caverns North. There is a distinction to be made about a room being loaded and being visible. When a room loads initially, the collision is loaded and interactable, but it is occluded. When you transition to a room or open the door, it will no longer be occluded or secretized. The final bit of knowledge needed to successfully navigate out of bounds or wall crawl is the transition between rooms. On a surface level, the dock is a trigger that handles which room you're in. Transitioning between rooms involves passing through the room's dock. Upon transitioning out of a room, the connecting rooms of the previous rooms will be unloaded. You can only interact with the immediate connecting rooms of the PAB. Attempting to manually load a connecting room outside of the PAB will secretize the room instead. There are a few methods to getting back inbounds. Door warping, which involves the room's collision loading around you and navigating to the door to transition. Ceiling warps, which is using the morph ball to unmorph through a ceiling. Note that this requires being outside of the PAB. Grabbing items or otherwise initiating a cutscene that repositions you will set the PAB to be that of the respective item or cutscene. At this point, we've covered many concepts, including the properties of Aether and collision, navigating a room, loading rooms, transitioning rooms, and getting back in bounds. There is a ton of information, so try not to feel overwhelmed. With practice, this knowledge will become intuitive. Thanks for watching.